Welcome to this episode of Food for Thought. I'm Deborah Walker, and today it's my absolute pleasure to bring you Ralph White, who's the co-founder of the New York Open Center, the city's leading venue for holistic learning since 1984, where for many years he has served as the director, program director, and senior fellow. He's a writer, lecturer, radio host, organizer, creative director, editor, and an amazing world traveler. Ralph is truly a pioneer in the global consciousness movement and has created and produced many hundreds of conferences, workshops and performances across the spectrum of holistic learning. From 1995, he edited Lapis magazine, winner of the Alternative Press Award in 2000. He's also taught at the New York University and has been a seminal presence in the development of the global network of holistic centers. He's the author of a beautiful book called The Jeweled Highway, which is the book we're going to discuss today. Welcome, Ralph.
Well, thank you very much, Deborah. Great to be on your show.
It's my absolute pleasure, I have to say. Your book is beautifully written. The story of your life is truly amazing. And I lost myself within it from the moment I started reading it. I just want to thank you for actually writing such a stimulating and interesting read.
Well, I'm thrilled that you liked it as much as you did. Yeah, all right.
On reading your book, I wanted to sell my house and just go. I realised that I hadn't lived at all. Seriously.
Go where? Hit the road?
Maybe it's always been in my unconscious. But I realised that I hadn't lived at all. And I'd done a lot with my years, Ralph. But actually, it's made me question everything that I'm doing. But more importantly, yes, what I'm not doing. What was your intention in writing The Jeweled Highway?
What was my intention? Well, I thought it was a story worth telling. It was both a personal story, obviously my own adventure, my own quest for meaning, my own path to find something of value to contribute to the world. But I also thought it was a story of a generation as well, of the people of my time and what we went through. And I also wanted it to be an inspiration to younger people too, so that, so many people these days with whether it's the economic situation or debt or wherever it may be, don't feel that they can actually pursue their inner vision. And so I wanted it to be an encouragement to people to follow their heart, to stay true to it, to not give up, and not to just get sucked into the corporate morass, but to actually discover some real path you want to contribute, or find a path to what you want to contribute in the world, and then go for it. So I guess maybe that's it as clearly as I could say it. But yeah, I just thought it'd be a good story. Also, I wanted it to be enjoyable and entertaining for people too. I didn't want to write a ponderous tome on consciousness. I wanted to engage people. But yeah, I think I wanted to just inspire people and tell them a story worth telling that has something to say about our time, I think.
Now, you're most obviously not a New Yorker from your accent. Tell us about your Welsh beginnings and why they're actually so important.
I was born in Wales. I was born in Cardiff in post-war years, and lived in Wales, up in North Wales in Llandudno till I was 9. Then we moved to Huddersfield in Yorkshire, to the thick of those dark, sooty, satanic mills. So I spent most of my teenage years in the north of England in the 60s. Thank God for the music. That was what got me through that. And then I came to the States in 1970 as a postgraduate student. I'd done a degree in American Studies at the University of Sussex in England. And so I came, and really that's what set me off. For that first Christmas in 1970, I answered an ad for a co-driver down Route 66. And that turned into a whole spiritual journey down there, an awakening, you might say, down there in the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. And from that point on, I felt I had to really dedicate myself to exploring these deeper spiritual or mystical truths. If those experiences in the deserts were real, nothing could be more important. So that's when I left graduate school, moved to the West Coast. In that case, it was Canada, British Columbia, and then began to really immerse myself in this material to see if the spiritual path actually might really be legitimate, because I certainly didn't grow up with a spiritual worldview. So yeah, that's the beginning of the story.
Now, after that first trip out west, nothing was ever the same again for you, was it?
Well, no, it wasn't. No, because I did have, just the vastness of the of the starlit skies, the silence of the great deserts, just hearing the pure sound of silence on some 14th century Native American ruins in the painted desert of Arizona. And then really finding myself in West Coast counterculture in California. I felt like I'd come home, actually. I felt I'd been waiting to meet those people all my life. There weren't many of them in Huddersfield, I'll tell you that. And yes, that's what got it all going there. And of course, then here's the funny thing. I spent my life believing that I was half Welsh and half Northern Irish. And I had my DNA done, and it turns out I'm 11% Native American. So it's no wonder. I mean, still that blows my mind. But no wonder I had my great awakening in the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona.
I recently watched something where people were tested, their DNA was tested, and actually it was given back to them. And clearly we are from widely across the continents, and where we may think we're British or we're Spanish, we're actually a real mixture, as you've just said.
Yeah, we're a total mix. Yes, that's why any kind of racism is absolutely ridiculous. We're all a mix.
Do you think that's why when some people arrive in a distant continent, they just feel that they're connected?
Yeah. Well, I think we're living in a time where it's more about soul connection between people than it is about blood and family connection.
That's interesting. So what specifically happened to you when you did that trip? You went out and you say, it was the vastness of the skies, the silence of the desert, but
I would say an opening of the heart, an awareness of the somewhat constricted worldview I'd developed, that it had a lot to do with me shutting down personally as an act of self-defense, and that if actually I wanted to live in a rich, colorful, vibrant, engaged world, I had to myself open my heart, engage with the world. It was a sense of being part of a larger reality, a sense of some kind of deeper spiritual presence within my own being than just the chattering of everyday consciousness.
Fascinating.
And it was a sense that this more mystical perception of the world, I'm not the first person to discover it. It may not have been part of academia in any way, but in fact, world literature is filled with descriptions of this experience. And so then I began to find all kinds of books that spoke exactly to what I had gone through, and that's what really gave me the conviction to leave this relatively safe world of graduate school and head off on my own into this quest for meaning.
Now, you talk about academia, and it was very much that you left it behind, and the quote from your book, at university the old philosophical cliche still reigned. Do you think our education system's still holding us back?
Well, I'm a bit out of touch with the educational system in Britain these days, but yeah, from what I hear of it, yes. I mean, all this awful standardized testing, whether it's in the States or whether it's in the UK, I think that's absolutely terrible. I mean, it's just that where we have an educational system that is by and large focused on turning people into cogs in the global economic machine. We've come a long way from the original meaning of that word education, which comes from the Latin educare, to lead out from within, that potential that is within the individual. Instead of doing that, what something like Waldorf education does, the work of the schools that have come out of the work of Rudolf Steiner, they have a holistic approach to education, educating the head, heart, and hands of the child. But I think for most people in regular schools, it's just work to a standardized curriculum to prepare you for the global economic marketplace. And I think that's a complete betrayal of what education should be.
Yes. Now, you touch on Steiner's work in the book, and he spoke with great insight into the 21st century and the urgent need to transform worldviews and our culture from materialism to the awakened free spirit. But his work has enormous scope, but people, even like myself, struggle to really interpret it. How can we take that and actually
Well, somebody really should write the Dummy's Guide to Rudolf Steiner. If we can have one for Freud and Mao and Marx, why can't we have one for Rudolf Steiner? Probably because there's not a big enough market yet. But
is it the time for that?
Yeah, well, maybe I should do it. But well, he's just, you remember the old line, isn't it, in the Bible? By their fruit shall you know them.
Yeah.
I mean, Steiner does get wild and far out because he's capable of journeying into the deepest spiritual places and remaining fully conscious while doing it. But look at Naka, and he brings a lot of pretty far out insights into the nature of the human condition. But if we ask ourselves that fundamental question, what did he leave behind? I think you can say that Rudolf Steiner unquestionably left the greatest holistic legacy of the 20th century. I mean, if you and I were to found the renewal of organic agriculture in the 20th century, we'd be happy with that as he did with biodynamics. And if we would have found the world's most widespread independent approach to education, the Waldorf schools, which when he died there were only 2 of, and now there's well over 1,000, and they're spreading like wildfire in China of all places. And then that's just a couple of the things that he left behind. But because the main body of his work is 25 years, 6,000 lectures, 350 books worth of the deepest and very beautiful, most beautiful spiritual and esoteric teachings about the deeper nature of reality. So I certainly hope that Rudolf Steiner becomes much better understood than he is, and we do need to find ways to make it more accessible to people. That's the biggest challenge with Steiner, is actually finding the path in to his voluminous and compelling work. I did it just by tuning into picking up intuitively the book. For me, it was in Hawaii. I was in Hawaii, and I got a book called The Tension Between East and West by Steiner, because I thought Hawaii would be a good place to read a book with that title, and it just spoke to me immediately as soon as I began to read it. So that was my doorway into Steiner. I think everybody probably has to find their own.
So potentially it's about timing.
Yeah, so it has to come to you at the right time. I mean, some people if you just come to Steiner too early, I think it can become such a comprehensive worldview that you get sucked into it and you lose some of your independent thinking, potentially. I'm glad I didn't really get into Steiner until my mid-30s.
Now, you've been influenced by a number of other authors along the way, and you mentioned them across the book. In fact, my reading list has extended quite significantly. To touch on, we've got Steiner there, Ram Dass, to just name the couple. But what are you currently reading, and who's influencing your thinking at the moment?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I mean, I hate to admit it, but since I got an iPad and started reading on the internet, I read an enormous amount online now, rather than actually reading a lot of books the way I used to. For years, I read 6 or 7 books simultaneously. So now I am more caught up in the world of current affairs and how consciousness moves through the world of current affairs. So, I mean, what I happen to be reading right now it's about Norse mythology, because I've done this 21-year series of conferences called Esoteric Quests on the Western esoteric tradition, and I've got one coming up at the end of August in Iceland. It's called An Esoteric Quest for the Mysteries of the North in Iceland. So I've been reading books on Norse mythology. I'm looking at one now actually called Norse Mythology and the Modern Human Being by Ernst Jüli, and another one called The Northern Enchantment, Norse Mythology, Earth Mysteries, and Celtic Christianity. So that's what's on my reading table as we speak.
I'll add that to the blog at the bottom. Were you conscious that you were going on a spiritual journey when it all started, or were you just naturally an adventurer?
No, I was just naturally an adventurer, as I mentioned in the book. I mean, when I started hitchhiking from Huddersfield when I was 16, I stuck my thumb out and that first truck pulled over on the Manchester Road. I mean, God, that rush of ecstatic rush of freedom and ecstasy up my spine was extraordinary. I can still remember it all these years later. So for me, it was the same when I hitchhiked to Machu Picchu from Vancouver back in 1973. I could tell. I'd been in Vancouver. I saw a picture of Machu Picchu on TV. I had a strong intuition to go there. But I'd always wanted to set out and hitchhike to the end of the road ever since I started hitchhiking to Wales from Huddersfield when I was 16. So it was there was the adventure aspect for sure, just as there was the road trip aspect of going down Route 66. But it was simultaneously looking for the miraculous, looking for something deeper. We used to carry the books of P.D. Ouspensky's book In Search of the Miraculous. I don't know if you know that book. He was a student of Gurdjieff in Russia in the early 20th century. But no, it was both. It wasn't either or, I would say. It was, I have always had a strong feeling for freedom and adventure, but by the time I set off to hitchhike to Machu Picchu when I was 23, I was already exploring a spiritual path. So I was looking to gain some insight into the mysteries of the Toltecs and the Inca, and just to be in those mountains and to go into a part of the planet that I knew nobody who'd ever been there before.
And you've done that even across Bandit country with parcels that you've been asked to deliver, haven't you? And this isn't just any minor hitchhiking you do.
Yeah, right. Well, there's another. I wanted to make the book engaging, of course. So there is another chapter in the book called "Request from the Oracle of Tibet," which is when, after the first 5 years of the New York Open Center, I decided to go around the world just to refresh and renew. I was fried through having poured all my energy into creating this Center for Holistic Learning in New York City, where the place they said it could never be done. So anyway, I spent a month in the monastery of the State Oracle in Dharamsala, and at the end of it, the head monk came to me and told me he had some material they wanted delivered to Tibet, to their sister monastery in Lhasa, and they'd been waiting for the right person to take it, and they felt it was me. So would I do it? And they said if I would, they would put me under the protection of the Nechung Chogyam, the Nechung protector, the Pahagyalpa, the protective deity of Tibet, and the Dalai Lama. So there's a whole chapter. It's the story of what that was like to travel on foot through the eastern Himalayas at the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre.
It's just an astonishing journey you took.
It was definitely one of the wilder and crazier things I've ever done in this life.
Now, you touched on the New York Open Center. Do you want to just give my audience an outline of actually, because we're in Britain, so they won't really know what that is actually about. Do you want to just explain what that's about?
Yeah. Well, let's see. I don't know what the equivalent might be. There is no real equivalent in Britain, but it's New York's main Center for Holistic Learning. It's been going now since the beginning of 1984. It offers a year-round series of programs, lectures, workshops, conferences, national, international conferences. It covers a bunch of areas: wellness, the body, health, and all of that, psychological development, personal growth, human potential, world contemplative, mystical, and esoteric traditions, creativity and the arts, and holistic science, and lastly, social and ecological transformation as well. So it has a whole set of programs. It's opencenter.org, but center spelt the American way, ER. If anybody wants to look it up online. So it's been going now for all that length of time. We've had over 300,000 people who've come through, and the conventional wisdom when we started was get out of here. This is New York. This is the real world. And indeed, New York 30 years ago was mayhem. But clearly the fact that all those people have come through, and that now the holistic material is everywhere if you have an eye to see it. There are constantly articles about it in the New York Times. There's a yoga center on every Fifth Street corner in Manhattan. The largest grocery store in New York is Whole Foods, which is natural foods. So, when we started off, this was all very peripheral, tangential, marginal, wasn't considered to have any significant relevance to the way society was going. And now you see it everywhere if you have eyes to see it. So that's the Open Center, and it's one of a network. There's a global network of holistic learning centers. In fact, we just met in Quebec City back in May. But there's a brand new center, Le Monastère des Augustines, which has emerged in the oldest monastery in North America, actually, built in 1639 by French nuns. So, so today we've moved from being completely peripheral and marginal to a growing and increasingly rich network of centers worldwide who actually know each other and support each other.
It's just an amazing legacy. And you've been involved with setting up these holistic programs worldwide, but you were very integral in the growth of Findhorn, weren't you? Which a lot of people will know because they're in the UK.
Right, yes. Well, after my travels in South America and my time in counterculture California, I did wind up for a spell for 3 years in the mid to late 70s. At Findhorn in the north of Scotland. I was looking for a sense of community. I describe in the book arriving there on New Year's Eve in the waning hours of 1975 in a snowstorm and walking into that community center and having an immediate sense of familiarity as I walked through that door. But I know half these people on a dark, snowy Scottish night in the middle of nowhere after years in South America and California. And indeed, many of those people are lifelong friends. In fact, I'm going to see one of them tomorrow in Oregon. And so, yes, that was a very special experience for me. I think, what did I call that chapter on Findhorn? The soul finds community, the heart begins to open. That was a wonderful time to be at Findhorn. We were all young. We were in our 20s. We were filled with idealism. We wanted to pour our energy into creating something new. Findhorn saw itself as a center of demonstration, where it could actually demonstrate to the world that you can live in a more harmonious relationship with both your fellow human beings and with nature. And so, of course, we were into, organic agriculture and windmills and solar panels and composting and all of this stuff, years and years and years ago. And it's great to see renewable energies now becoming as popular as they are, and organic agriculture. So, that was a very special time, great time to be young. And as I was saying, many wonderful lifelong friends that stem from that period.
I thought it was very funny when you said that most hippies had the ability to do anything from plumbing to mechanics, because they basically had to turn their hand to anything in between what they wanted to do.
Well, yes. I mean, that was something noticeable about the American ex-hippies who built a lot of Findhorn in the 70s. They had an amazing ability to actually do anything: pour concrete, construct buildings, repair cars. I think it was a class system in Britain. You didn't have so much of that. So, our Australian and American hippies were very, very together on a practical level, and they made a big contribution. I don't think it's the same today. I don't think there's as many Americans now at Findhorn as there were when I was there in the 70s. But still, that was a special time to be there, yeah.
And the other thing I thought was interesting was how you worked alongside some people from the military as well, which also helped change your opinion about
Yeah, that's right. I always assumed in my alternative worldview that anybody who had made a career of the military was a fool in some way, or it was a daft thing to do. And that was one of the learnings I definitely got from Findhorn. There were a number of people. Peter Caddy, one of the founders of Findhorn, had been an RAF squadron leader in the Second World War. And Findhorn was right next to an RAF base too, Kinloss. And so there were a number of community members who came from that world, and the chairman of the board, Captain R.N. Ross Stewart, I can still remember him now, a wonderful man. He'd been the captain of a battleship or a battle cruiser, I think it was, in the Second World War. I mean, these were wonderful people, just exuding, integrity, grace, charm, intelligence, humility, actually. They certainly weren't Rambo-like figures. So, my father went through the thick of the Second World War. He always told me from a very clear age, don't ever get involved in war if you don't have to. There's absolutely nothing glamorous about it. And I always respected that view that he brought there. So yes, it was a surprise to me, but I learned, it's good to have these mind-opening experiences along the way to help us get us past our prejudices.
And I think what I found fascinating, but also humorous at times, was the different types of teachers that you've had throughout your whole life. Dennis, your tutor, I should say, that the whole issue around him avoiding the draft by going into a mental asylum to get him.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that was my first real American friend in Chicago when I got there in 1970. Chicago was extremely dangerous at that time, and you had to learn to be street smart very quickly. So Dennis was my tutor, and he was a fellow teaching assistant at the university there. I owe a lot to him, but yes, he had been drafted for Vietnam, and he'd exhausted every possible way to stay out of it, and finally his last resort was to have himself committed to a mental asylum, and then he escaped out the back window. So actually the guy who taught me how to be street smart in Chicago was one of the sanest people I've ever met, was an escaped lunatic, but he was one of the sanest guys I ever met. But that's what America was like in those days. It's hard to remember, even people who come and visit America from Britain today, just how divided it was at the cusp of the 60s and 70s when Vietnam was at its peak and Black Panthers were being murdered, and the brutality of the police towards demonstrators, as we know from the '68 convention. It was a horrible thing, and you could have cut the tension with a knife in Chicago at the time between the supporters, the reactionary supporters of Mayor Daley and the war, and the alternative counterculture and the black liberation movements, etc. So, yeah, it was a fascinating time to come to America. And of course, I'd done a degree in American studies, so that's why I came here, was to check it out in person, in the flesh.
And I thought it was also very funny when you say you arrived and your colleagues were getting ready for revolution, and at their weekends were learning how to fire machine guns.
Yes, it's true. I can remember a guy going up to Wisconsin on the weekends to prepare for the revolution. I mean, it all seems so kind of ridiculous in retrospect, but that was how it was, when hundreds of people were being killed in Vietnam and everybody was being drafted. And of course, there'd been the assassinations of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King, and the racial tension was at its peak. I mean, it just felt like America was about to explode. And of course, Nixon was in power with all his malign intentions and manipulations. So yes, it was a very dark and dramatic time. It was fascinating because the music was great, but it was a wrenching time politically.
So have you been?
But also a time of great spiritual exploration, I would say, all of the above.
So have you been part of a quieter revolution that's taken over by stealth, do you think?
Yeah, well, you're right. You mean I say at the back end of the book that it's more been an evolution. I think I've been more of a cultural evolutionary rather than a political revolutionary, although I think there are similar goals in mind ultimately to take us towards a more just, sustainable, balanced society. But yes, I think we have seen over the course of my lifetime, over my adult lifetime anyway, an amazingly progressive permeation of mainstream culture by holistic practices. I mean, meditation used to be considered a fancy word for sleep. The New York Times used to write editorials regularly 25, 30 years ago, dismissing every form of alternative complementary medicine as snake oil. Anything mystical was thought to open the doorway to the irrational and potentially to fascism and so on. I mean, there were these kinds of attitudes around, whereas I think people can feel today increasingly that we're living in a spiritually empty, materialistic consumer society that is both wrecking our souls and our well-being and is really deeply damaging the planet. Of course, we see it most clearly through global warming. But I'm glad that insight came to me, when I came down to sea level again in Peru after being in the Andes for months and saw Western civilization with clear eyes and had that moment of intuitive knowing, this thing is damaging our souls and the environment, and it has to be changed. In a sense, that gave me an agenda for the rest of my life to work on creating those alternatives. So yes, I think there has been this progressive, subtle permeation of our culture with these kinds of ideas. And if you have the eye to see them, they're everywhere. And if you're blind to them, which sadly most of the mainstream media is, you can't see them at all. So I think one of the reasons I wrote the book was just to point out how there is this larger consciousness movement, whatever we call it, a holistic movement, a consciousness movement. Can we even call it a movement? Because a movement implies that somebody's directing it. But this is not being directed. It's a spontaneous thing. When these centers, holistic centers, gather from all over the world, we can tell immediately we're all, broadly speaking, on the same wavelength, even though we're all entirely independent initiatives. And that this is arising, nobody's organizing it. There's no billionaire who's behind it all. It's a spontaneous awakening of consciousness on a planetary basis. And, there can be a lot of New Age fantasy about that, which I've never liked. But the fact is, when you go to one of these gatherings of centers, you've got the living proof right in front of your eyes that there is something profound at work, and that people are looking for something beyond just the rush, the stress, the materialism and the consumerism of everyday life.
Do you think people are at a point where they know they want to need something different, but they don't? It's a bit like when you've got a craving for chocolate, it's really about the magnesium that's needed. But instead of eating the greens, you end up eating chocolate because it's actually the thing that's in front of you. It's the easiest to find. Do you think we're at that point where people know that they should be doing something different, but actually they're just finding the first thing that's in front of them at the moment? And they're starting to search.
Well, yeah, some people are. Everybody's looking for happiness on a certain level. And whether it's, the pub or football or whatever it may be, and not that I've got anything against either of those. I'm all in favor of both pubs and football, but it's a question of balance, isn't it? If all you're doing, if you're looking for a sense of meaning and purpose in life in the bottom of a beer glass, you're unlikely to find it. Or at least that may be your journey for a while, but hopefully it won't stay stuck in there. And so I think some people are awakening right now in increasing numbers. When I look back 30, it's really, what would it be, 40 years now since I arrived at Findhorn. And, there's a definite progressive awakening happening. You're no longer surprised. You meet people who understand what meditation is. People understand what natural foods and organic agriculture are. People are open to mystical and spiritual perspectives. Meditation is so widespread, it's almost getting comical, references to mindfulness, because there's so much emphasis upon mindfulness meditation these days as the cure-all for everything. We're in a time of progressive awakening, I think. I don't think it's a straight path. I think there are plenty of regressive impulses that we have to struggle against, that go against the holistic and ecological worldview. I think, you've got nationalisms, inappropriate forms of, you've got religious fundamentalism, you've got the primacy of economic values in all spheres, corporate globalization, and you've got a wonderful phrase from Rudolf Steiner. Actually, he calls it the superstition of scientific materialism. Of course, scientific materialists think that anybody who has a spiritual view is superstitious, but he turned it around nicely there. And of course, barely a month goes by without scientists discovering some completely new dimension of the cosmos. We're living in an amazing thing out here. And that was one of the virtues of being under those starlit skies in the Andes and in the deserts of New Mexico. It's just to have that sense of yourself as part of an infinitely vast cosmos that we're only beginning to understand.
I'm at the point that the more I know, the more I don't know. And therefore I'm just constantly questioning everything. Yeah,
well, that's a pretty healthy state of mind to be in, I think. Yeah.
Now, you've had great insight into many societies across the world. Which culture have you visited that has left you with more questions than answers?
Which culture have I visited that has left me with more questions than answers? China, I'd say. China comes to mind. I mean, I was in China at the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre. I saw the aftermath when I got out of eastern Tibet. I did feel that I stepped into textbook Orwellian totalitarianism, the people's democratic dictatorship, and all this kind of disturbing stuff. And yet now, amazingly enough, now China is going through its own awakening in terms of psychology and spirituality and consciousness. It's absolutely amazing. I've just been meeting more and more people from China recently who are saying there's a huge crisis of meaning. You know, they've got the shopping malls now, at least the people who live in the cities, the middle class, but they've got the shopping malls and the designer brands, but it's not enough. Of course, they have enormous pollution. But in fact, there was an article in the New Yorker magazine a year or so ago talking about how Waldorf schools are spreading like wildfire all over China, literally hundreds of them opening up. And the collected works of Carl Jung have been translated into Chinese. And there's everything that the Open Center represents right now in terms of holistic learning is the absolute apex of interest for young people under 35. A good friend of mine is in China right now organizing a whole bunch of events around this. And we're working on trying to build a bridge, a consciousness bridge between China and the U.S. I mean, what's so remarkable about that is it's still a communist. This is nominally a communist society. And yet, so as long as you don't challenge the state and you don't get politically involved and you deal more with the psychological, the health, and the ecological dimension of things, it's acceptable to create that kind of work in China right now. So China's a mystery to, you know, it's a fascinating culture, how it can be both communist and capitalist and intensely materialist and have a spiritual or psycho-spiritual, should we say, awakening all going on right now. It's an amazing configuration. So yeah, I have to say I find what's happening in China now absolutely compelling. And how do you have this awakening going on at the same time that human rights lawyers are being arrested en masse? And there's a big clampdown on freedom of speech. Obviously, they're worried that as the economy contracts, there's going to be demonstrations on the streets, so they're getting more and more authoritarian. But at the same time, there is this more holistic awakening going on. So, yeah, maybe that's ultimately how freedom will come to Tibet, through China itself awakening over the decades to what a beautiful culture it has right on its doorstep.
Now, your book is a story of the quest for a meaning of life, and you say in the book, since late childhood I had wanted to know what we were all doing here on Earth. What was the point of existence? Did you ever find the answer, Ralph?
Well, in my own little way, yes. I think I have. I mean, I claim to have a definitive answer that I could roll out. But yes, I do have an overall sense that we're here to develop spiritually, and that we're here to do what we can to create a multicultural, harmonious, sustainable society that we live in. And, you know, it's that insight that people come back from near-death experiences with. You know, people who have those experiences gain two things. First of all, they lose their fear of death. And secondly, they realize we're actually on this earth to love each other, that love is the core of the human experience. So, yeah, I'd say that those insights, which have been common to all the mystical traditions of the world for millennia, I'd say I have come to that view. I do believe that love and freedom are the twin pillars of the human experience, and I'm trying to just express those and to make each day, as much as I can, a series of freely chosen acts of love and service. Sounds a bit inflated, especially in New York City, but in my own little way, that's what I'm trying to do.
Can anything be inflated in New York City, to be honest?
Can anything be inflated? Lots of people's egos can be inflated, I'll tell you that. Yeah.
Is there room for that? My last question, Ralph, is what's left for you still to achieve?
Well, that's why I wrote the book, come to think of it. I've organized and produced and directed countless events and programs over the last 30, 40 years. But it's more that artistic side of me, more being the writer. I've been so focused on making things happen in the world that I felt it was time, just time to step more in that writer's mode, to speak in a personal voice. I didn't want to, in the book, just convey to people a sense that it had all been a breeze, that it all just rolled out, A, B, C, D, E. It didn't. I wanted to actually show there were plenty of dark times and times of confusion, and you have to keep on going through those as well. So for me, it's a challenge I'm not necessarily a very self-disclosing person, so for me to share in the book, to be honest, about my moments of emotional vulnerability, my own confusion, my own doubts, etc. I wanted to make, so really what was left for me, writing this book actually is the big next step for me. And it's me moving more into that artist's mode, being more of a writer and being more of a speaker rather than being a producer and director and organizer of events and centers and so on.
Fantastic.
That's what it feels like, but who knows? Life is full of surprises. You never know what you're going to get next.
Particularly with you, I would suggest.
Sorry, what?
Particularly with your life, because it's just been the most amazing life where you've actually really done what a lot of people wish they'd done, which is just followed their calling.
Yeah. Well, I guess, that's a very clear and simple and I think maybe an excellent way to really describe what the book is about. Yeah, I just followed my heart. I followed my calling. That is the jeweled highway in a way. In that, you can interpret that phrase on many levels, but I think it is to do with following your heart and your own sense of inner vision, your sense of purpose, and not allowing conventional obstacles and worries to get in the way. Yeah, you've got to take some chances, you take some risks. You often don't know where it's necessarily going, but it can also do things like enable you to make a contribution. The renewal of a culture that's obviously in a bad way in many respects, like ours is, it's not going to come from the mainstream institutions by and large. It's going to come from individuals who've journeyed outside the mainstream, or from organizations or from initiatives that have emerged from outside the mainstream, and that can see it with a fresher eyes and can see the need for that more holistic and ecological way of being in the world. So, yeah, I think that's how it works sometimes.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Food for Thought and Natural Health Radio. You are truly, truly one of the most inspiring people I've ever had the opportunity to actually interview.
Well, that's lovely of you to say there, Deborah. Can I give a little plug for a few of my websites or anything? Is that okay?
Yes. Tell people how they contact you.
Yeah. Right. Well, I have a website, Ralph White, just spelled as it sounds, white like the color, ralphwhite.net. If anybody's interested in the book, you can get it from Amazon. You just put The Jeweled Highway, with one L. Actually, it's the American spelling, one L in jeweled, by yours truly, into Amazon, or Divine Arts Media is the publisher. You can also get it from them. For anybody who might be interested in coming to Iceland, or in that whole series of conferences now that's lasted for 21 years on the Western tradition, there's a website called esotericquest.org. And then the Open Center itself, the New York Open Center, just opencenter.org, center spelled the American way, E-R. And then the last thing, I might mention my Twitter feed if anybody wants to follow me on Twitter. I've just started doing that more recently, and that's Ralph_White. So it's very simple what my handle is on Twitter. And then, there's a whole other area we didn't get into, which is one of my big interests, which is working in the area of dying now. I've been doing this 5 major conferences over the last 20 years on the art of dying, spiritual, scientific, and practical approaches to living and dying, which looks at well, it sounds morbid, but in fact it's incredibly life-enhancing. I love that work. It's very beautiful to bring a more holistic perspective into all of that, and the spirituality around dying is 100% authentic, which is something I really find very, I appreciate very much. So yeah, I think those are ways, but the main thing is, yes, I just want to tell people about the book, The Jeweled Highway, On the Quest for a Life of Meaning. I hope that some of our listeners will be inspired to buy a copy. And I love that this is actually the first radio show I've done based in Britain or Ireland.
Yes.
My mother was from Northern Ireland. She grew up in Belfast, so it's actually really sweet to be talking to a show in County Tyrone. But I mean, I know you're internet radio, so who knows where people will be listening to this?
All over the world, including
all
Kazakhstan.
Over the world.
But yeah, we do have a number of people listening across Ireland, Northern Ireland, the UK, but we do have a huge listenership globally. We have about 2.5 million people who come to our radio station, and we're very privileged that they listen to us.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, keep up the good work, Deborah. I'm really delighted that you're doing what you're doing. It's all part of this greater work of awakening consciousness, and I'm glad we're all there, putting our shoulders to the wheel, trying to make something happen, trying to move our culture into a healthier direction.
It's made perfect because we get the opportunity to interview people like yourself, and you share incredibly. And that was always my aim of providing this platform. I provide Natural Health Radio so that people who will never get the opportunity to travel, actually have the opportunity to listen to great people like yourself. So it's made because of yourselves. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, have a wonderful day. Okay.
Yes.
Bye-bye.